Hi, I'm Jeff Strong. I'm creator of the auditory brain stimulation therapy, rhythmic entrainment intervention. I'm also co-founder and creative director of BrainShiftRadio.com. Now in this video, I want to talk a little bit about polyrhythm, ensemble drumming, and kind of where REI rhythms come around this. A couple concepts I'm going to cover today are how I developed my REI rhythms based upon ceremonial rhythms, and why I kind of broke it down into what I call a composite rhythm, which is taking the traditions and taking the four instruments and bringing them into one, and then on what I did with that in order to make it calming or focusing when I'm doing REI. Now keep in mind that REI, rhythmic entrainment intervention, is all about playing drumming rhythms at about 8 beats per second to stimulate the brain and synchronize it to an alpha state of consciousness. Alpha state of consciousness is a relaxed, alert, not neurological state, a little slower than our normal wakefulness. It's still an outwardly directed state, then it's a place where we're neurologically calm. All traditional drumming exists in another state of consciousness called theta. Now theta is a little slower than alpha. It's anywhere from about 4 to 7 beats per second. And theta is an inwardly directed state. It's a meditative state if you're at the lower end, and more of just an internally directed kind of introspective state when you're kind of moving up. It's a great place to be in when you're doing ceremonial drumming, drum circles, because it kind of brings you into this really kind of otherworldly place. But theta is not a great state when you're doing it therapeutically. When we're using drumming to influence the brain and behavior, we want to be in alpha. Alpha is about 8 to 12 beats per second. Most REIs at the low end, right around 8. BrainShift Radio will have tempos all over the place, depending on the category you're in. But just looking at kind of the basis for REI, 8 beats per second compared to traditions, which are all between 4 and 7 some beats per second. The ceremonial drumming with multiple drums that you'll hear, those are going to be anywhere from 6 to 7.5 beats per second. So they're going to be in the mid to upper end of theta, still inwardly directed, but kind of musical in their tempos. And when I've talked about drumming and calm and focus, I've talked a lot about variability, complexity, repetition, what that all means with different tempos. Basically, the bottom line is the slower you play, the more repetitive your rhythm can be. But the faster you go, the more variable and complex the rhythms have to be in order to engage the brain. This is all about entrainment as well as stimulation in the brain. If we're just looking at, the spiritual end of drumming and how it feels and how we can kind of connect, it doesn't really matter too much, especially if we're playing, because when we're playing, we engage in a different way than if we're listening. All REI is people listening very quietly in the background. It's about stimulating the brain in very specific ways. Drumming spiritually is really about playing and kind of being involved in the process, whether you're playing the drum or dancing or just kind of participating by hand clapping or whatever. With all those pieces aside, I want to talk about polyrhythmic drumming. This is the idea that you have all these rhythms going on at once. It sounds really complex. The reality is it's not all that complex. So when I talk about complexity with REI, polyrhythmic drumming really doesn't fit into that, because even though there's multiple parts going on and it appears complex, it's not variable enough to keep the brain engaged. So for instance, if I'm playing in an ensemble, and ceremonial drumming is really ensembles. When I played Shango, the tradition that I have as a basis for where I kind of drew from in the techniques that I use, we had 4 different drummers. It was actually 3 drummers and a percussionist, a bell player. And each of the parts were unique. We had a low drum, the tuba, which I played one part. The kunga, which is the middle-sized drum, played another part. And the quinto, which is a smaller drum, higher-pitched drum, played another part. The 3 of those blended together to create their own complexity. But again, I'm playing one rhythm repeatedly. The kunga's playing another rhythm repeatedly. The quinto is another rhythm repeatedly. They're not really changing. So bar by bar, that same pattern happens. So there may be some complexity, but there isn't variability. And the variability is really important to engage the brain when we're up in the alpha state of consciousness. In theta, it doesn't matter quite so much, especially 6.5, 7 beats per second, where you're going to find these rhythms played, because they can have the effect they're going to have. But I want to talk a little bit about how I kind of constructed REI rhythm from the ceremonial rhythms, kind of give you an idea where this comes from. So I'll play some different parts for you. This is a traditional rhythm in 12/8. So it can be counted 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, or 1 ta ta, 2 ta ta, 3 ta ta, 4 ta ta, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. The most common way to count it is 1 ta ta, 2 ta ta, 3 ta ta, 4 ta ta, with the 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s having the pulse. So it's a triplet feel. 4 parts. There's, like I said, there's the low pitched drum, which is the quinto, or there's the low pitched drum, which is the tuba. That's this drum here. I'll play the part for you here. It's a fairly simple pattern. It's pretty much a bass pattern. And basically you've got a bass on 1, a bass on 3 of the first measure, a bass on 1 of the second measure, and the bass on 3 and the second ta of 3 of the second measure. So it sounds like this. And then I'll be playing open tones accented on the 2s and the 4s. So it's going to be like this. Pretty straight ahead rhythm, pretty simple in itself. When you add it to the other rhythms, it starts getting more interesting. So the conga has open tones and slap tones, and basically you're doing a slap on 2 and 4 of both measures, and you're using open tones to kind of go in and through that. And so it sounds like this. I'll count it in 1 ta ta, 2 ta ta, 3 ta ta, 4 ta ta. So the quinto part is mostly slap tones. There's some open tones on the 1, the last ta of 1, the last ta of 2, and then the slap tones through the 4. And so it sounds like this. So that's the basic layout of how this rhythm would be. And then you've got a bell part, which is kind of cool. It's a single pitch. A lot of times bell parts go back and forth between 2 pitches. This is just a single pitch, and it goes like this. Pretty cool. So all of that breaks down into when I took these ceremonial rhythms and started playing them by myself, I wanted to kind of create what I call a composite rhythm, which is a rhythm where I take the essence of each of these parts and bring it into one drum with a different orchestration to kind of give it the feel of the overall ensemble with one person being able to play. And this is a similar concept that happened with traditional ceremonial drumming shifting into the drum set. As a matter of fact, when I was going to the Musicians Institute, we spent a lot of time on Latin and African drumming, and we looked at the traditional orchestration of the different drum parts like these, but we always translated them into the drum set. So you had the tuba part played on the bass drum, for instance, and the bell played on a cymbal, and the quinto part played in the snare drum with or without the snares. And then you had the tom-toms playing the conga part. And the idea here was that you had one person being able to play what was usually played by an ensemble. So when I learned Shango and played in the ensemble and then wanted to start playing one-on-one with people, my teacher Lloyd showed me how to start breaking these, or bringing these individual rhythms into a composite rhythm. And that's where they came from. And I have a video, actually, the first video I ever did, and the quality's not very good, but I talk about a 21/16 rhythm that I use for hand flapping motion. And I kind of break down where it came from, the composite rhythm that Lloyd showed me, and then how I morphed it into the rhythm that became the REI rhythm. I'm not going to go that far with this. I'm just going to take these rhythms and bring them into a composite rhythm so you can kind of hear what this sounds like. So we've got these different parts. The tubas playing this bass part, really fairly simple. You've got a bass on the 1s and the 3s, and then second measure, you're putting an extra bass on the last ta of 3. It goes like this. Then you've got the conga part kind of playing across the 2. then you've got the quinto part with the slaps, open tones going in the 1 and the 2 and the 3, and then across the 4 you've got slap tones. And then together these create a composite rhythm that sounds like this. And you'll notice I varied it a little bit because that's what I do. And that is where the difference with using the traditional rhythms and REI comes in. Because again, the traditional rhythms, you have just basic rhythms playing. And they're playing around 6.5 beats per second. They're playing along, and yeah, the quinto player will play solos on top of it to control the intensity of the ceremony, and that's called heat. The hotter the ceremony, the more things that can happen. You got to moderate this with the intensity of playing solos or not. And that's the quinto parts player for the most part. But really the way the ceremonies work is you get a rhythm happening and it keeps going. It doesn't really change. And the idea here is that you have the same rhythm going on so that you can have the influence that you're trying to have. Which has a great effect when you're at 6 beats per second. 6 beats per second, it doesn't have to be terribly variable. It just needs to be somewhat interesting. And when you've got polyrhythms happening, 3 different rhythms kind of blending together, the different pitches of the different drums, the variations are going to happen because of the way the players interact with one another. That's enough variability to engage the brain at that 6 beats per second. You speed it up to 8 beats per second and it's way too repetitive. And I can show you a very concrete example of why that is, or at least why we know that's the case. In the early 90s, I did my first clinical research projects. 94, my first published paper. I spoke at a lot of conferences on this. It was basically using my drumming in a school classroom in St. Paul, Minnesota. We were looking at children with autism and whether we could calm. The study went really well. It was custom-made recordings. Everybody got their own recording based upon me playing for them live. So I played for them live, saw how they responded to the music. I made a recording based upon that data. They listened to it over 8 weeks and we saw changes. To follow that up, I was encouraged to do some double-blind, placebo-controlled studies. And that meant 2 things. Number one, I needed to come up with an REI recording that was consistent for a broad base of people. So I took, for instance, that first study and I looked at what was common in all those recordings for the kids in the study and made a single recording for autism, for instance. We were looking at calming autism. And so that was the recording. And then we had to come up with a placebo recording. And what I need to do is I needed to really look at the variables of what we were doing with REI. What were we looking at? What were we trying to understand? And really the goal here at with REI at the time was that if I played specific rhythms at 8 beats per second, it would have an impact on anxiety levels and other behaviors over time. So the key here was that it was a single drum played with variable rhythms at 8 beats per second. So we wanted to make sure the 8 beats per second was consistent. So we found a recording of traditional ceremonial drumming, which had 4 or 5 drums, actually 3 drums and bell most of the time. There was no solos, it was just the bed tracks, the basic rhythms, because we wanted to look at the 8 beats per second. Is entrainment the key to this? If we entrain the brain to this relaxed neurological state, can we see changes in behavior and anxiety versus the variable rhythms that I was going to use with REI using the single drum? That's what we were looking at. And we got this recording. The traditional rhythms were traditional tempos, 6.5 beats per second. We sped those to 8 beats per second. The recording was 20 minutes long. There was 5 compositions. So you had 4 minutes of the same rhythm going on, and then it would switch to another set of rhythms for 4 minutes, and to do this for a full 20 minutes, all at 8 beats per second. The REI recording was 8 beats per second with me playing the variable rhythms using composite rhythms that were always changing. And the way the study worked out, it was double-blind, placebo-controlled, which means we didn't know who got what recording. We had 40 people in the study. We were doing 3 studies at once, by the way. We were doing an autism study, an ADHD study, and a chronic pain study. And so each had different recordings. The placebo recording was the same across all 3 groups because we figured it was a fine recording. But for the REI recording, there had to be something different from the ADHD to the autism to the chronic pain. And even as it is today, it's very much that case. As a matter of fact, today we do custom still because through these studies, the series of double-blind studies where we used a generalized recording, we realized we couldn't have the same effect that we could custom. But that's for another video. This one I want to talk about what happened as we were doing this. Like I said, everybody was randomly chosen for which group to be in. We didn't know who got what recording until the end when we opened the envelopes and we're collating the data and looking at it. But we noticed something almost universally early on. What we did was we gave them an intake form. We did the intake, and then 4 weeks down the road, we gave them another form for them to fill out to see what was happening. And then 4 more weeks we did the same thing, and then 4 more weeks did the same thing. We were looking at what the changes were across 12 weeks. And what we noticed was after 4 weeks, when we sent out the data, we noticed anxiety levels went up in about 20% of the people. We didn't know what was going on, and we kind of just watched them, and we noticed that almost all of those people by the second 4 weeks, this is 8 weeks into it, were dropping out of the study because the anxiety levels had gotten so bad that they couldn't be in the study any longer. And so we wanted to track them at the end and see what recording they had. We didn't know. It was like 20 to 25% of the people in the autism study dropped out, about 20% in the ADHD study dropped out. It was less in the chronic pain, but we did notice that there weren't changes happening, which I thought was interesting. Anyway, we get done with the study and we look at the data and we realize that everybody who dropped out was getting the placebo recording. Not a single person who listened to the REI recording dropped out of the study. As a matter of fact, we didn't see any raised anxiety with the REI recording, and we saw tons of reduced anxiety. But we saw a lot of increased anxiety with the placebo recording with the polyrhythmic drumming. And the reason that happened, by the way, is because that polyrhythmic drumming didn't change. Yes, there were 5 different compositions in that 20-minute recording, and there was a lot going on, but it wasn't changing enough. And the person listening deciphered the pattern really quickly, and now it wasn't calming. And now they're listening to it when they don't want to necessarily, and it's getting irritating for them. That's what happened with those recordings. Slow those rhythms down, it's fine. But at 8 beats per second, it's too fast to have a good effect. So ceremonial rhythms, polyrhythms played at a slower tempo are fine. If you speed them up and then you put a solo over it that is constantly changing and varying, it seems to work okay. You'll find that in brain shift radio a bit. We do some of that. But rhythms that go on too long at 8 beats per second are irritating if they don't change, even if they appear complex to begin with. So you have to vary it. And I've talked a lot about this in my videos, that it's important to vary the rhythm if you're up at 8 beats per second. If you're down at 4, 5, 6 beats per second, don't worry about it. Just play something interesting at 5, 6, 7 beats per second, maybe a little change here and there. But when you're up at this alpha state of consciousness, you need to vary the rhythm so that the brain doesn't become habituated to it and shut it out. It needs to be interesting. It needs to be something that can't be predicted ahead of time. And that's the goal. So when I take the traditional ceremonial rhythms and I create a composite rhythm, I then morph it a little bit, because that's what ends up happening when I'm watching behavior and I'm looking for a change. That rhythm ends up changing. It ends up usually being at some bizarre meter. And I talk about this in that 2116 video. But I also create a musical variability in the rhythm. And I'll do that now. I'm going to play this basic composite rhythm, and I'm just going to move around on it at 8 beats per second and vary it a bit so you can get a sense for what this feels like. This should be calming for you because it's going to be at 8 beats per second and it's going to be smoothly varying. But this does come from ceremonial rhythms that use a very static set of rhythms that sound complex to begin with, but once your brain figures them out, are not complex anymore. So I'm going to play for a little bit, just kind of settle back and listen. This is a ceremonial rhythm in 12/8 at that I've made a composite rhythm from and am doing a variable kind of calming recording with it. So it sounds like this.